Hi there. I started making beef jerky in 1972 when I was an airman. Didn't make much money, and I got the idea of maybe making jerky and giving it out as Christmas presents because I couldn't afford much. So for the last 40 years I've been making jerky pretty much every Christmas, and people have demanded I make it on occasion, not at Christmas. My father used to ask me to make it several times a year. So I perfected the recipe. Used to be a mess. I'd do it in the oven, and now I've got it down to a recipe that actually works, easy to do, and everybody loves it. I have people come back that have worked in my yard a year ago asking if I have any more beef jerky. I have people that want to know how to make it, so I decided to do this YouTube video, and hopefully you'll enjoy it and try it. So I'd like to go through and actually mix up a batch of the marinade I use. I like to start with the dry ingredients so I don't get my measuring spoons all wet and everything a mess when I try to put it together. So I start out with a tablespoon of ground pepper. The next thing is the crushed red pepper, and this is one that's very sensitive to making your jerky spicy hot. So I found that if I use a teaspoon of this in my marinade, most people like it. Any more and it starts getting a little too hot. One teaspoon of that. Next is the garlic powder. This happens to have a little crushed onion and parsley. I don't think it makes a difference. But the garlic powder is another tablespoon. Next thing is some dehydrated onion, and that's kind of an optional thing. I use a tablespoon of the dehydrated onion. And here's another one that makes the hotness, the more you use, the hotter it gets, is the cayenne pepper. And once again, I've found that I've made it too hot in the past, so I've limited the cayenne pepper to 1 teaspoon. I think this is a very important ingredient, and I'm not sure why, but I just think it is. It is white ground pepper, and I've been using that for the entire time I've been making jerky, and I've come to believe that it's very important in the process. The white pepper, I use 1 tablespoon. Okay, so now I'm ready for the wet ingredients. Probably the main ingredient is the soy sauce. And the soy sauce, I actually need a measuring cup because I use an entire cup of soy sauce. And if you'll notice my ingredients, there's no salt. And I think it's because the soy sauce contains enough salt to keep from adding any extra. So I use 1 cup of soy sauce. And these don't have to be exact, but I have made them pretty close over the years. Okay, the next ingredient is Worcestershire sauce. I see I have a brand new bottle that's hasn't even been opened. There's not a lot of Worcestershire sauce that goes in because I found that it does become a stronger flavor if you put a little too much in it, and it sort of overwhelms the jerky. So my Worcestershire sauce is, where is that? 1 tablespoon. So now I'm getting my spoons wet, so if I dipped it in something dry, it wouldn't stick all to it. 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce. I've got the soy sauce. This is liquid smoke. I'm not even sure that it does much, but I've been adding it for years. I use 1 teaspoon of liquid smoke. And this is an ingredient that can really vary your flavor too, judging by the type of hot sauce you use. I like the Tabasco sauce with chipotle in it. And I use a tablespoon of that. It's really not that hot, so 1 tablespoon is not that much, but I know you can get some very hot sauces. And I add some white wine, about 4 ounces of white wine, and it can be any wine that you have. This happens to be a white wine that we had left over from a party, so I add 4 ounces. You can use a dry sherry or any sort of white wine. 4 ounces. And I think the most important ingredient is a hot sauce. I've used different brands. This is Mrs. Renfro's green salsa, and it's a hot one. I've used La Victoria, and I think this is the ingredient that really sets the jerky apart from other jerkies. I use 8 ounces of this. This is a 16-ounce jar, and I've got about 2/3 of it, so I'll just dump about 3/4 of what's left in here. But I think that's probably the real flavorful part of the jerky. So I have my medicine while I'm making it up. And the last thing I add is about 16 ounces of water. So I'll run over here and get some water. And the water is mainly just to give it volume. When you marinate the meat in it, you want it really saturated so it really soaks into the meat. So here's my marinade. And this marinade will make about 6 pounds of jerky. And I'll talk about the meat that I use and how I prepare the meat in the next scenes. So this is what my marinade looks like, and it's a pretty strong concoction. I wouldn't want to have a shot or anything of it, but this will marinate about 6 pounds of beef, which after dehydrated, depending on how much you dry it, could be anywhere from 2 to 3 pounds of jerky, likely. So we're in the next step of the jerky making process, which is slicing up and marinating the meat. You can use different kinds. As I mentioned before, you want the leanest meat possible. And I like to use flank steak. So here I have a slab of flank steak. And I like to cut it in 3 sections. And the main reason for that is when you make the jerky, you can cut it in small enough pieces that it fits easily into quart Ziploc bags when you give them away. So I make a slice about like this, and there's a couple little tricks to slicing the meat. Is if you do it cross grain, the jerky is a lot easier to chew, and if you do it lengthwise with the grain, then it's more stringy, and some people like it better one way or another. Also, I have to, you need to trim off as much fat as possible. Fat, when the jerky's drying, kind of bubbles up and makes grease itself on the jerky. This happens to be pretty lean, not much fat on it. I'll trim it off, and then I'll take the pieces and put it in this bowl and add some of my marinade. See, a little slice of fat, and I'm doing it lengthwise. And one of the keys, you need to make them all about the same thickness. I do about 1/4 inch and put it in the bowl. And when I get a bunch of it in there, I'll add some marinade and mix it up. Okay, so as I slice up the meat, I get a portion of it in there and stir up the marinating sauce that we made before. Dump some in. And stir it up to get it all marinated and start soaking in the marinating sauce. I do this about 3 times as I'm cutting up the meat to make sure that all the meat gets some marinade in it. Okay, so I finished slicing up the meat. You can see I didn't have a whole lot of fat, basically from about 6 pounds of flank steak. I've added all the marinade. I got the liquid in here, stir it up to make sure marinade gets on all sections of the meat. I do sometimes get giant Ziploc bags. I think they're 2 or 3 gallon bags, and I'll put the meat in there so I can squeeze it periodically to get it marinating better. But I think this works, and we'll cover this up with plastic wrap, put it in the fridge and leave it for at least a few hours and probably overnight. And tomorrow we'll be ready to start dehydrating the meat to make jerky. So we went through the first step of making the marinade, and then the second step was cutting up the meat and putting it in the marinade. I have it in this bowl. Like I said before, it's about 6 pounds of beef, and I've stirred it every once in a while to make sure that the marinade saturates each piece of the meat. Now this is the dehydrator I use. It's made by Nesco, and I think they're about maybe $80 to $100 online, and they come with 6 or so trays, which I'll show you one of the trays. They're screens that you lay the jerky out on. They come with 6, like I said, but I have 10. I've accumulated over the years. I actually have another one of these dehydrators where I've cut out the screens and made a stack big enough to fit a bowling ball in there, and it works really well to clean the oil out of your bowling ball. So now I just put the individual slices of jerky laid flat on the trays. You try and not touch them together as much as possible, but it shrinks up a lot, so it kind of pulls itself away anyway. But you can get quite a few pieces of jerky on one tray, and I just go around and spread it out the best I can. There's a few little irregular cut pieces from the meat that you fit in well. And as I mentioned before, the important aspect of this is that all of the jerky is cut about the same thickness, so you get the dehydrating time equal for everything. And in the liquid, it doesn't matter if it's saturated with the marinade. You'll get a lot of moisture that'll drip to the bottom of the machine, the dehydrator. And when the fan is on, you actually get a lot of moisture coming out the bottom vents. So I put the dehydrator on a surface that's not going to be affected by moisture or water coming out as the jerky dries. In this case, I have a granite countertop. So the beef took about 6 strays, and you can see that it's saturated with the marinade. There's very little marinade left. I think we started with about a quart total, and there's not that much left. So you want the meat as saturated as possible, and put the dehydrator on. One of the things that I learned through the years is this dehydrator talks about 160 degrees for beef jerky, and I found that I don't do it that hot early until it starts drying out. Otherwise it has more of a cooked meat flavor than a jerky flavor. So I started out at about 135 degrees. Plug it in. And as I said, I have it on the counter that moisture won't hurt because the air and moisture blow out the bottom. And there's so much marinated dripping over it, it might actually get puddles of marinade and water around these vents that I wipe up periodically. So there we go. We leave it at 135 degrees. And about 2 or 3 hours from now, I'll rotate the trays because I don't think the temperature is equal all the way through this. So I periodically rotate the trays from top to bottom. Okay, so we've been drying this for about 12 hours, and I started it at 135 degrees. And one thing you can see is any fat that's in the meat sort of starts glistening in little bubbles. on the different pieces of jerky. So I take a paper towel and I'll just do this to the top one. I take it around and I pat off as much of the grease as I can. That makes it last longer. And I'll do this for every one of the trays. And then I'll turn the pieces of jerky over, turn the heat up to the maximum of 160 for another hour or so, and it'll be done. Okay, so here's the end result after 6 pounds of flank steak. Pretty much got 3 Ziploc quart bags full of beef jerky. This one was full, but of course you sample it while it's dehydrating to make sure you get it to the dryness that you want. And I also had a ping pong tournament in my garage and everybody got samples and everybody wanted the recipe. So here's the trays we use. The cleaning isn't that difficult. I soak them in soapy water and rinse them off, and occasionally a little brushing to get some of the dried stuff off. So the end product, I love giving it away. I've been doing it since 1972, giving away Christmas presents. And to this day, I'll have people that haven't seen me for years say, "Do you still make that beef jerky?" So it's a great gift, personal item you can make for folks, and I guarantee you'll almost generate a cult following and people will ask for it for the rest of your life. Thanks. Not yet. Erase.